Welcome back to another live stream. What the fuck happened in economics in 1971? We saw a divergence between compensation to employees and productivity. There's a lot of stories about it, a lot of theories, a lot of conspiracies. We're going to explore it all today. I've got Steve Keynes and Mike Radzicki. Stay tuned.
You are now relearning economics.
Hope you are well. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave comments underneath the video. That always helps, of course. Let's put up some logos here. You know it. I'm Ty Keynes, the Relearning Economics channel. You can do all those same things on X. We're going to talk about this today. We're going to talk about the divergence, and it's not even popping up. There we go. Geez. Slow graphical interface. You can see it right on screen. Compensation just kind of stopped in the early 70s, and productivity continued to rise. There's a lot of nuances here. There's arguments about this graph and the indexes that were used or changed at the time. And obviously, we've got all the theories around why this happened, but we're going to try to explore them all, and we're going to try to get to the truth, or to some version of the truth. Fake news? I don't know. And we'll do this with Steve and Mike. I find I like economics in the current era. I don't really care so much about the bullshit that's come in the past, but I do care in a sense that our economic system is path dependent. So what happened in the past is obviously affecting what's happening now, and from that degree, I care what's going on. And from a modeling perspective, structurally, what's happened at least back to the 70s, not much has changed. It was a little more financialized now, but the system structure, in my opinion, if we look at it from a macroeconomic sense, hasn't changed in a while. So I think this is an important detail to cover. And I'm going to bring them both on, bring on Mike, or going to bring on Steve. Get the buttons confused. Going to bring on Mike. Mike, how you doing?
Yeah. Doing okay, end of our term. So busy time here at WPI, but it always is busy, so whatever.
Good stuff. Steve, how about you? How are you doing?
Oh, better than I was a few weeks ago. Things seems to be, looks like we're getting funding to try to take Ravel to the next stage of commercializing it. That's been a good outcome. That'll happen in the next few weeks. Yeah, just the usual crazy. And I have a bit of success on YouTube. My last video on Australian house prices has cracked over 250,000 views, which is pretty good in 1 week. So things are going okay. Things are looking up.
Fuck off. I'd like a 250,000 views. Get out of here. That's at this point, we'll just.
I've ruined my rep. Yeah, there goes the friendship. Okay.
Yeah. At this point,
too much envy. All right.
We're gonna give Mike the first question I got here, and Mike, I don't know if you got the emails on what this show's going to be about, so maybe you're flying by the seat of your pants. But we're talking about what the hell happened in 1971, and obviously you saw the chart there. But what I want to get from you is what was going on before that in the 60s and maybe in the 50s, and from a US perspective, what was the economy gearing towards in that time, just so we can set things up for the 70s before we actually get to the 70s.
Yeah, see, it is seat of the pants. I didn't get the memo. It's probably my bad. I've been real crazy busy. Well, of course, you're talking about post-World War II. And so one of the worries by Alvin Hansen, the American Keynes, not the American Keynes, the American Keynes, was would we enter secular stagnation, all these GIs, sailors, and Marines coming back and flooding the job market? Would the Great Depression resume or not? And of course, it was just the opposite. The U.S. became the manufacturing power, economic locomotive of the world. Its industrial capacity was really ramped up for war production, and they converted back to civilian production. They had all these GIs and sailors and Marines who wanted to start families and have houses, blah, blah, blah. So you had the 1950s things started to roll. And it continued into the 60s. You really had the social unrest with the Vietnam War in the 60s. That's for the first time. But the economy, I would say, probably in the 20th century, had really not experienced a whole lot of high inflation. I'm not entirely sure if, in the 19 teens or something, if there was, maybe Steve could help me. But generally speaking, there was deflation during the Great Depression, if anything, and modest inflation in relative terms after World War II. And, things were a bit of a golden age. The today's economic powerhouses, or at least more recent powerhouses, Germany and Japan, were war torn, but they had the advantage they were going to get all new infrastructure through rebuilding. So they weren't rebuilt yet. And so in the 50s and 60s, economically speaking, we were rolling. Keynes came into, and macroeconomics came into being, really. It was, Keynes's book was 36, but the war, full stop and all that stuff. So it was in the 50s and 60s that macro really came into its own, as well as development economics. And so we thought we were able to get rid of business cycles because we now knew how to control things, control the economy. And it set the stage really for the stagflation of the 70s, as you can see the inflection point there, where there was quite clearly something happened. And I'll offer just three things, and then I'll let Steve weigh in. One was, of course, getting off of Bretton Woods. Number two was the OPEC oil embargoes around that time. And number three was, for the first time, we had inflation that was considered very high in the United States historically. And the Nixon administration imposed wage and price controls. There was two phases around that time. One was it was illegal to raise wages and prices, but companies started workarounds. Okay, I can't raise your salary, but you're doing a nice job. I'll give you a company car, an extra vacation weeks, or what have you. So in phase two, it became just unpatriotic to raise wages and prices. And then when you hit, I don't remember exactly, 74, 75, they said, this is not working. So they abandoned it. But all those things kind of happened simultaneously, more or less. And final point is, like the Great Depression, economists have debated what caused it, right? What caused the Great Depression? Was it a one-time anomaly, or what were the factors? Same thing here. I guess it's less dramatic, an economic disaster relative to the Great Depression. But economists, again, debate, what the heck happened.
So, Steve, you can add on to that, but I want you to kind of nuance too in this kind of round is what we're actually looking at, these two variables on the screen.
Yep.
What is productivity and what is compensation? Kind of add that in, make sure our viewers understand what they're seeing on screen right now.
The way productivity is measured is actually quite misleading, but the basic way it's measured is output per worker. And what that implies is productivity increases because output per worker increases because workers must be working harder or working smarter. It's actually got bugger all to do with workers. That's really telling how many machines are being used by the workers that are producing the output. And workers these days really tend machines. It's not their individual productivity, it's how productive the capital they're working with ends up being. And a large part of that comes down to how efficiently those machines convert energy into useful work. So that's the real cause of productivity, not the way we measure it. But the other, workers to wages, that obviously stagnated from 71 on. And if I can give a bit of a backtrack for Mike, how old are you? I've forgotten. When were you born?
During the Eisenhower administration.
Very funny.
I'm 67.
Okay, well, I'm 72. I wasn't born in 1871, Tony. I was partying at Sydney University in 1971, so I was 53 baby. But the basic story for the whole post-war period, I think it was David Margolin who coined the term, was the golden age of capitalism. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was, and this is pre-women's lib, so this is going to sound sexist, but what the fuck? One breadwinner, one husband, could earn enough money to have a wife and 4 kids and buy a house. That was a common situation in the 50s and 60s. So it was really absolute boom. As you said, the expectation that Keynes had and that Hansen transferred to America was that after the end of the World War II, there'd be a huge recession, we'd have secular stagnation. Bullshit. We had an enormous growth in economic activity. And my explanation for it, you'll be completely surprised and flummoxed, but they say it was due to credit and private debt, plus also oil. That's got to be factored in there as well. But it broke down starting in the early 70s for a whole range of reasons. But a major reason was that we ended the Second World War with the lowest level of private debt to GDP, not quite in America's history. It has been smaller in the past, but certainly the smallest we've seen in our lifetimes. And that was the aftermath of the Great Depression, when a debt bubble, and then the bursting of a debt bubble went from the 1920s to the 1930s. You then had the Great Depression, when there were all the bank closures and writing off of debt and so on. And then in World War II, there was nothing to spend your money on because all the consumer goods were under control. People paid their debt levels down during World War II as well. They were earning money in the military, or they were working in factories supplying the military and so on. So the level of private debt in let's see if I can get as far back as I can get it. Let's see. I'm cheating, of course, checking data as I answer the question. So the debt level in 1947 began at 47% of GDP. That's private debt. The first major inflection in the level of debt wasn't 1971, it was 1973. And I can actually, if I can share my screen, I can show that.
No.
I didn't. I thought
Let's get behind the scenes here. Before the show, everybody, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, notification bell, leave comments in the chat or the live chat. I discussed with Steve, I laid out the outline of the show, and I said, Steve, you know what? Don't jump ahead. You'll ruin the whole 2 hours.
I'm jumping in at the right point, though. This is my argument.
You're not. You're about an hour and 15 minutes into the show already.
Okay.
So, but you know what? This is a credit to Steve. Like he's gonna get to the point, and I guess I should have expected it. So I gotta adjust in the future. But we're gonna dial it way back, Steve. Way back.
Okay.
Jesus.
Well, I'm gonna get back to what was happening in the 60s. It was an absolute boom time. The unemployment rate in my home country was, put it this way, the government almost lost election in 1961 in Australia. Because the unemployment rate was almost at 2%. Okay, that was a crisis. Okay, and the only reason the Conservative government at the time, Robert Menzies' government, survived, you're not going to believe this, was by leakage of Communist Party votes to the Liberal Party, which are the Conservatives, rather than going to Labor. So the way the Australian electoral system works is you put your preferences down. You don't just tick a box or put a cross. You rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ranked choice, I think people call it outside Australia. And in the effort of one of the most conservative politicians, a guy called Jim Killen, who was quite a Reds under the beds type of personality, the fact that a number of Communist Party votes, rather than going one Communist Party to Labor, went one Communist Party to Jim Killen, because Jim Killen hung on to his seat, the Conservatives returned. If that hadn't happened, the Labor Party would have taken over in 1961 because of the horror of unemployment hitting 2%. Okay? And then ever since 71, it's been 5%. So the dark ages began, in my opinion, in 1974. When the downturn occurred. So we had an absolute boom situation. Workers had secure jobs. One single worker's income was enough to support a family. These days you need two and forget about the family. All this sort of stuff. It really was a golden age. And I think that's why you saw things like the Beatles turning up in the 1960s, Hyde-Ashbury in whatever that was in 65, student rebellions in France in 1968. It was a wild time to be alive. And yes, I remember, because at that stage I hadn't discovered marijuana. So if I remember the 60s, they only say you weren't there. I was there. I was a school student, and I was looking on in envy what was happening for those who were older than me at the time.
All right. So Steve Keen's getting out of control. We're only 15 minutes into the show. Mike, there's an elephant in the room in this, right? And it's a very libertarian stance, and that is the end of the Bretton Woods, essentially, in 1971, with Nixon ending the gold standard. Mike, is there a correlation there, a causation? Is it just happenstance? It happened at the same time and we see the divergence. Your thoughts on that?
That's one of those I'm not sure about. Certainly it's correlated. The world economy and world trade was just growing so rapidly, you couldn't have world currencies converted into the dollar, anchored to gold. So you just let everything freely float. And then you got into dirty floats and all this sort of stuff. And so that one, I don't know. Maybe Steve has a better idea on that one. But one other point, I'll pivot just a bit to get this on the table as well. I think labor solidarity really started to take a beating in the 70s. In the certainly prior to World War II, the labor movement started, and it was absolutely necessary in the United States, where you had 12-year-old boys chained to weaving machines and all sorts of crazy stuff, working 15-hour days and what have you. And but after World War II, unions were still very strong. You know, the Walter Reuther's of the world and what have you. What's good for General Motors is good for America, and the American auto unions were very strong, and steel workers and what have you. But I think, again, circling back to after World War II and the rebuilding of Europe and Japan, primarily, other nations as well, giving them new infrastructure and so forth, they really started to eat our lunch in the 70s. When I was a child, if you had a little toy and it was cheap and it broke easily, you said, "Oh, made in Japan." It meant cheap, flimsy, what have you. Once you got into the 70s and 80s, particularly with cars, motorcycles, this sort of thing, steel, made in Japan meant super high quality, right? And American cars were, and motorcycles and what have you, for example, were seen as flimsy and poorly made. I think, and that led to, weakening of the labor movement as well. We will import our cars, our high quality cars and machine tools and what have you, rather than producing them domestically, and that weakened the labor movement. So I think that probably is intertwined as well.
Good.
But the Bretton Woods thing, there's a lot happening there, and I'm not entirely sure, but maybe Steve has a better grasp on Bretton Woods versus productivity.
Okay, well, Steve, touch on the gold standard ending. I've got my opinions. It's fucking meaningless, but add something there, and then nuance that. I want you to kind of slide into what was happening with unions at that time as well.
Yeah, the gold standard was part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was not what Keynes wanted. Of course, it was what Harry Dexter White wanted, and that was Keynes wanted to use a neutral, non-currency, basically a unit of account called the Bancor for international trade, and wanted to limit trade imbalances. And Harry Dexter White, because he was the American rep and he dominated the hearing because of his personality combined with the fact that America was the dominant country at the time, you got the American dollar, and it was linked to 35 American dollars could buy 1 ounce of gold. This is all the opposite of what Keynes wanted, okay? And then what happened as a result of that is, first of all, because the American dollar was used for international trade, you had to have the American dollar to trade, whether you were buying American goods or not. That overvalued the American dollar, which meant the manufacturing sector of America was handicapped compared to the rest of the world, having been the sector that the industrialization of America was dramatic at that time anyway. But of course, it was the huge expansion of industrial capacity during World War II that that meant America was the most advanced country on the planet at the end of World War II. But instantly, when it became the currency, it was working with a 30 or 40% handicap in terms of the price of its goods compared to the price of goods elsewhere. You also had, as Yanis Varoufakis emphasizes, because you needed American dollars, America had to run a trade deficit. So that meant other countries could run a trade surplus, and that's where the revival of European manufacturing began, with exporting goods back to America. And then the interesting thing about Japan was that America was so arrogant about having won World War II, ignoring the fact that the Russians actually won it, that they didn't want to take any advice from this bloke called Deming. And Deming was an expert in, as you'd know, in system dynamics and industrial organization. So the Japanese Ministry for International, was it Industry and Technology, International Trade, MITI? Forgotten what the actual initials stand for, but they invited Deming to go to Japan, and then he taught them his quality controls idea in Japan, which Japanese took advantage of. So Japanese factories ended up being much more efficient than American factories because Japanese people listened to Deming, whereas the Americans refused to take any notice of him. So Japan started getting a big manufacturing lead over America as well. And then with the level of exports from Europe back to America, the level of American dollars turning up in Europe and France in particular was enormous. And Charles de Gaulle, who was the president, was it president or premier? I don't know what they actually call them in France, but he was the same as Macron. So is it president? I'm only guessing. I can't remember. He threatened to take advantage of the $35 for 1 ounce of gold and ship all of transfer all the American dollars that France had accumulated through this trade surplus and buy all the gold in Fort Knox. He could literally have done it. And that's when Nixon broke from the gold standard. But there's actually a second reason for that break from the gold standard, because at this stage, the American multinationals were everywhere. You know, General Motors had plants in different countries, and there's a General Motors plant in Australia, for example, making cars that no longer exists. But all these American corporations had operations between countries within the one company. So they realized this is a congressional study that I read back in the 1970s. I can't find a copy anymore. I'd love to find a copy. It was, of course, only in paper in those days. But they looked at what happened with American corporations as the Nixon's break approached. And what happened was they began to expect there was going to be a break. So what they told their subsidiaries was, take your time to pay that bill, and we're going to pay our bill to you straight away, which meant that a whole lot of money was converted from American dollars into French francs and German marks and Japanese yen and Australian dollars and so on. And then when the break was made and you went from it being $35 per ounce of gold to 42, which is a massive devaluation of the American dollar, they then they went back to the old terms again, converted those Australian dollars and Japanese yen and French francs back into US dollars and got a 20% appreciation. So that is the conclusion of the congressional study was that what actually triggered the devaluation of the American dollar were the actions of American corporations trying to take advantage of a devaluation.
So what was there any like, I get everything you're saying there. Would that have any influence on that divergence between compensation to American workers in the graph's case and productivity in the US? Is there any way we can, say, okay, there was a little part to it? Like, I'm trying to appease the libertarians out there and
that's fun.
really well, well, I'm really trying to.
I prefer to poke them. Sorry.
Yeah, I get what you try to do, and I do that too, and we get ourselves in trouble on social media all the time.
I hate being in trouble on social media.
But is there a case there that can be made that that definitely influence compensation in the US. Or you know what, have we've dug into this enough? You laid it out there, Steve.
I think a lot of it is a breaking of the power of the trade union movement over time. And again, this reflects history, which of course is left out of neoclassical thinking. So you don't ask a neoclassical economist about history. But in the World War, the Great Depression and World War II were huge shocks, disturbances to people's attitudes about American society. So when there was, the place was the Roaring 20s, everything was going gangbusters, party's going to go on forever. 1929, the stock market crashes 10% in one day. All the banks, not all the banks, but a huge number of banks were sent bankrupt by that, because back in those days they could own shares. So when the shares fell by 10%, their value of the assets fell. A lot of them were bankrupt. You had unemployment rose from a recorded rate of 0%. That's how low the number of people who registered for unemployment was in 1929, from 0% to 25% in 1932-33. It stayed high throughout the whole of the 1930s. The lowest it got to was 11%. When Roosevelt was persuaded to go back onto balancing the budget, it went up back to 20% again. And then the World War II struck and it plunged. Everybody had a job. They're all involved either fighting in the war or working in factories. Women had to be conscripted effectively to work in factories because a number of men had gone across to work to be in the war effort. So there was full employment, not just of men, but fairly larger level of employment for women as well. And when the war was won, the attitude, certainly in Australia, but also I can tell from friends in the United States as well, we have to make sure the country is good for the working man, okay? Because so many people died in World War II. Such a horrible decade, the 30s beforehand. The social attitude was we have to take care of everybody. And therefore, we've got to make sure the lowest paid worker in America gets a decent living standard. That was the attitude. Well, 25 years of economic stability after 1945 and basically screwed the fucking working class. Let's go back and start taking the money out like we did in the 1920s. And you can see a real shift in the attitude towards the power of the wealthy, and the Ayn Randian type stuff was growing. And at the same time, the trade unions and strikes and stuff were all seen as counterproductive. And economists played a huge role in undermining the role of unions in that whole process. So you basically shifted from where you cared about the working class and the lowest paid person at the end of World War II, where you couldn't give a fuck about them in 1971. Not quite that complete, but that's the direction we were moving in, and we've stuck there ever since.
Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave some comments. Steve, fix that camera. This is another pre-show conversation we have. Steve has a little box around his camera, so we're getting a nice shot, a high definition shot of his teleprompter. There you go. Oh, they're looking good. Mike, I know you're going to say something. You can say it, but I also want you to, because you what year were you born in, Mike?
58.
58. Okay, so perfect. You're going to be able to talk about the culture of unions in the 70s. So say what you're going to say and then kind of talk about the culture of unions in the 70s.
Well, I was going to say another thing that happened right at the time of that inflection point was Nixon opened up China with ping pong diplomacy. He sent table tennis players to China, and with the notion of opening up.
I actually learned that in the movie Forrest Gump. I don't know if you guys remember Forrest Gump.
True story.
Yeah, I didn't remember that scene.
It was a true story. Yeah. It was ping pong diplomacy. It was called in the newspapers.
Yeah. So anyway, in fact, I had a colleague who had inherited his father's business called Rob Roy. I think the name is for a hair products or hairstyling company right now, but back then it was Boys Clothing. And when he took it over from his father, right when Nixon was opening up China, he went over to China and he got the rights to the Snoopy, Charlie Brown characters, and had opened up factories in China to produce boys' clothing with the Peanuts characters on it. And he made a lot of money doing that. So again, look at the trade we do with China now. This international trade, Japan's W. Edward Demings and his statistical process control. I think he went over there actually to help with the census because he was a statistician after World War II. And then he said, you know, nobody's listening to me in the US about my thing. I'm really interested in statistical process control. And of course, they started eating American manufacturing's lunch. So all of these things led to, hey, as kind of modern Marxists would predict, let's open up production overseas. Labor costs are cheaper. The guy who taught me labor economics, I've mentioned before in our live streams, Chuck Crapo had a model that we were taught, which was ability to pay, ability to make pay. And he said, if labor wants to be well compensated, or in the case where labor is well compensated, you have both. The company has the ability to pay, which usually means they have some sort of monopoly or a moat, as Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger would say, you know, network effects, patents or whatever that prevents competitors from stealing market share. So they can pay, but then you need the workers have to have the ability to make the company pay. And that typically is your labor movement. And so the companies were making money, they had the ability to pay, but the labor movement, I think, was weakened by probably a lot of factors, but certainly by moving production overseas. And in terms of when I was a kid, what the question was?
Well, because you guys are both so old, like, and I have no context of the 70s, like, what was the feeling? So I know what the feeling is for unions right now, especially in Canada. We are a very unionized country, but we're seeing that kind of decline at this point. I'm asking your perspective in the US in the 70s. What were unions then to the people?
Oh, yeah. So unions were still, when I was like a teenager, high school student, college student. Before that, I kind of was not aware of that sort of stuff. I could tell you I was in a union. I was an operating engineer. And because I worked for 4 summers laying gas pipe. And you had to join the union. And you had every paycheck, they took a chunk out of your paycheck for union dues. But I made it through bachelor's, master's, and PhD without owing a cent because I made a ton of money working in the ditch. So, and you know, unions were seen as
that's better than making a ton of money working on the street corner, right?
Never did that.
Okay, that's ditch versus pitch, is it? Okay,
but unions were seen. I think it was kind of again, when I was a teenager, how much did I pay attention to this stuff in the 70s? I think it was if you were from a white collar household, if your dad was a white collar manager, you know, you'd hear at the dinner table, oh, Jesus, the shop floor guys are threatening to strike, pain in the ass, whatever. And if you were a blue collar worker, you had just the opposite. You know, the damn white collar people are taking all the money. We're getting killed here on the shop floor, you know, this sort of thing. So there was a bit of a, it never really came to violence. Well, the only violence was when I, in the 50s, before I was born, in my hometown of Sheboygan, Wisconsin, there was the Kohler strike. Kohler makes, to this day, bathroom fixtures, bathtubs and stuff. And that was apparently a really, really bitter, vicious strike. And it pitted brother against brother and what have you. And so that was the only labor strife I was ever aware of. The parents of my friends would talk about it. Oh, in the 50s, we had the Kohler strike. But otherwise, there was just a low level of tension between blue collar and white collar workers. Like I would go to my dad's company picnic every summer for was the families, every employee, blue collar, white collar. And there was kind of self-organizing. The blue collar people would stay by themselves and the white collar people would stay, and their families would stay by themselves at the picnic grounds. So it wasn't overtly hostile, but it was, there was a bit of a, let's call it tension or whatever.
I think that there's an interesting element to which trade unions were seen as disrupting the production, and therefore, you know, as consumers, you don't like production being stopped. As workers, you want to make sure you get your share in the wage rises. So, and I think I've seen interesting arguments about why did Japan have a different history on this front to America. And the basic story in Japan was that trade unions were company trade unions. So if you worked in Toyota, there was a Toyota union. And that meant that when there was the bargaining was actually symbolic, that it had big demonstrations. They were more for theatre purposes, and there was a desire to maintain a decent income share for the workers in the Japanese system. And the Japanese would do theatrical stuff, but they wouldn't actually stop production. Whereas America, you had trade unions. So if you were a plumber, there was a plumbers union. If you were the what's the one for the Jimmy Hoffa was from the
Teamsters,
the Teamsters, the transportation, etc., etc. So in that case, you were across a whole range of companies, and they're all trying not to pay the extra wage rise. So you'd shut down the industry, and that then meant you inconvenienced the public in a way that didn't happen in Japan. So I think that stuff, and this also applied in Australia, by the way, undermined the attitude that people used to have that unions are making sure we get part of the pay. And this is the attitude in the early post-war periods to the unions of screwing up our transportation. And so you got negative attitudes towards unions becoming commonplace. And of course, economic theory amplified that, because according to neoclassical economic theory, unions are a monopsony buyer, and that means you're going to get a less efficient outcome in the market. And if you read even a Mankiw textbook today, it'll tell you that unions cause unemployment by setting wages above equilibrium levels, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole political apparatus was anti-union, and there is an extent to which unions fed that. I mean, I've got to give a little anecdote from my own experience. One of my first girlfriends was doing a degree in industrial relations, and what you asked to do is go and interview either a union or a manufacturers group, and she chose the Vehicle Builders Union, which of course was involved in all car manufacturing. And we went to meet the guy, and he was the chief of the union met us, and he was talking about how we don't care about stuff like soap in the washroom. You know, we want to get the wage condition increases. And while she was talking to this guy on her own, I quizzed all the workers in the union and asked them, what cars do you drive? And then have a conversation, Ford versus Holden. You know, it's like Ford versus General Motors in the States. And I thought they're talking about cars like consumers of cars, not like makers of cars. And when she came out from a meeting, I said, you know, what did you pick up from this guy? And this is basically arrogance towards the workers. And I said, look, I wouldn't be amazed to see these guys get muscled by some of the workers in the next dispute. Well, that actually happened a couple of weeks later. There was a strike at a South Australian factory. They sent down one of the union organisers to stop the strike, and the union members threw the guy over the barbed wire fence off the plant there. So there's ways in which unions contributed to their own demise. But what you had was, in the 70s, it was the break of any strong capacity of unions to bargain, to share in productivity increases. And I think that's a larger reason why we saw that break in the 1970s.
Yeah, even in the United States, there are different states that have right to work laws or prevailing wage laws. And companies will move production facilities not out of the country, but to a different state, a right to work state, which means that you don't have to join a union if you don't want to, and then it's up to the workers. And usually wages are lower, and they present a case as to why unions are bad for the workers. You pay all these dues, you don't get anything for it. It goes to political cronies and what have you. So.
Now, here's and this is going to get a little off topic, but I was thinking about what you guys were saying. Right now, we have a pretty massive strike here in Canada, and we got a lot of like crown federal corporations, and it's the mail service, so the Canada Post. And I would give some arguments that unions stand in the way of progress sometimes. And so with Canada Post, obviously over the last 20 years, we have email now, we have digital delivery services. And so one of our ministers in charge of Canada Post, it's like a pseudo corporation, but it's government owned, but it kind of runs independently, kind of like a central bank. And so the minister said, you know what, we can't do home delivery anymore 5 days a week. We're going to drop that. And the union lost their shit. But the reality is that that service itself, there's not enough, money left in it anymore. And the unions decided, let's go on strike to try to keep this service alive. That's not really productive for the economy anymore. Are there some situations where unions stand in the way of progress and make things a little bit worse for the general public when they disrupt systems? Because in Canada's Post case, we still do need physical mail deliveries. People are actually getting physical checks from the governments. There are physical packages that have to be delivered. What's your thoughts on that? That unions might be counterproductive in some situations.
Let me just jump in real quick with a modest comment, and that is, if you look at union membership in the private sector in the U.S., it's been declining over the last 40 years or so. But in the public sector, it's been stable or rising. And the odd thing about that is the traditional reason to have worker solidarity, to have the workers collectively bargain, is a battle over wages and profits, right? That the capitalists are driven by the profit motive and they exploit the workers and what have you. Well, in the public sector, there is no profit. So why, presumably the government would protect the workers. So why do you have a union? That's kind of a bit of an odd thing. But at any rate, I'll let Steve.
Well, there is the argument there. It's still, regardless, the government could just prop up that system, but it's using resources, and that's maybe we're pushing up against a resource constraint that we shouldn't be utilizing. So there's the counter argument to that. Steve, what were you going to say?
Well, I think it comes down to that difference between company unions and industry unions, because if you look at the successful unions in Japan, which are still quite strong, they are company unions. And so they're going to try to make sure that the workers get a share of the increase in output, productivity gains, and so on. But they're not going to shut down the whole industry. So I think just that little fact that industry unions in Japan tended to be based in the company means that there's more of a capacity to bargain. The union is bargaining with the managers of that company for maintaining a decent payment to the workers, as well as increasing productivity. Like one of my friends on my Patreon, Brian Hanley, a guy that I do a lot of work with. Brian's had every bloody job on the planet, but at one stage he was involved in redesigning manufacturing systems, and he said, like a manufacturing operation, when you've got things like Deming's quality control involved, might have 100 changes to the process every day. If you take a huge factory and all the changes that occur to improve different stages of the production process, if you have a company union, then the union is part of that whole retraining process. If you have a industry union, there's no guarantee that's going to happen. So you can actually have a sense of disconnect between the union and the management, where that disconnect doesn't apply when the union is part of the company or is within the company as well. So I think that's a reasonable reason why the decline in union membership was greater in Anglo-Saxon countries, where the tradition was having industry unions, rather than Asian countries where they came out of the keiretsu system in Japan, of course, where you had agglomerates of manufacturing and banks, and there was the Mitsubishi and the Mitsui and so on, all these keiretsus. The unions were formed within that as well. So there was a degree of identification that unions had in Japan that doesn't apply in America. And in some ways, being more adversarial actually worked against unions in Anglo-Saxon countries, being more cooperative, but still demanding a share of the profits and wages, work better for Asian countries.
So we're going to kind of switch this. So it kind of ties in with unions. We're going to talk about the generation of the time, and specifically the baby boomers, which were coming of age during the 70s. I'll start with Mike because I think he's more of a baby boomer. Steve's more like the lost generation. Like, I think he might be older than a baby boomer.
No, I think he's a baby boomer.
I'm a baby boomer.
46 to 64.
I'm a traitor to my class, or my age class, but I'm definitely a baby boomer.
Lost
53.
generation.
Okay. In the
That's
theory
before
of the
the greatest generation. That means he was born in like 1902 or something.
I know.
Which one was the lost generation? Oh,
It was
that
That's
before the
Second World
greatest
War.
generation.
The lost generation is 1930s and 1940s. I think. Is that correct?
no, I think the greatest generation is what Mike was
Okay.
saying.
Yeah, the
is
World War II folks. It was the ones before the World War II.
they were
GIs and stuff. It's
the lost
Yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
And
20s and 30s.
just to nuance it out there, I was really disturbed that I'm considered to be a millennial, a very old millennial. It starts in 1983. They've now made a new generation called the Zillennials, and it's basically a hybrid between Gen X, which I respect a lot more than the millennials. So I am proud to say I'm a Zillennial. Anyways, that's another story. Mike, I'm going to bring up the chart on the screen, and you can see where the baby boomers between 1960 and 1980, you can see a decline in the age of occupants in the economy. And it starts right around 1970, especially in like construction, laborers, et cetera, et cetera. Did that influx of workers, baby boomers coming into the labor force, have an effect on compensation and maybe to an extent unionization?
Well, certainly, your younger workers are typically paid less than the veteran folks. So yeah, I guess, and we're looking at averages and such. So yeah, I would say so. And I think a lot the bubble of people moving through the system from the baby boom affected not just that, but the types of products that were offered. McDonald's took off because little kids like hamburgers and French fries. Later on, when the baby boomers
away
got
from
older,
screaming kids back at home. Yeah.
and when they got older, they started, luxury automobiles or what adults, when the baby boomers got older and what have you. So you can kind of trace a lot of stuff that happened in the economy to that bubble of people. But back then, when I was in that cohort, when I was in high school, for example, you'd go to your guidance counselor and they'd look at your grades and your test scores and what have you, and you're either going to go white collar college or blue collar. If you were blue collar, you're going to head down into the basement to all the shops, woodworking, metalworking, plastics, mechanical drawing, and what have you. And if you were college bound, math, chemistry, physics, and what have you. And it was that's just how it was. But when you would graduate high school and go blue collar, you'd get a good job. Like my high school classmates in the mid 70s that went blue collar, they all got really well-paying factory jobs. They all could buy a house, had a car, had a boat, had a cottage up north, and could send their kids to school and what have you. So it was a good life, even though it was blue collar, which there's nothing wrong with blue collar. I work with my hands all the time in my wood shop, so it's cool. But that is not the same as today. I think the pendulum. Last comment is, I think the pendulum is swinging. AI and such is making some of the white collar stuff go bye, and the folks who can do stuff with their hands are going to be in great demand. So it's weird
until robots turn up and take their jobs. Yeah.
So Steve, again, the same question to you, but I want to add in another aspect of the baby boomer generation who entered the workforce, and that was women. Now, it wasn't necessarily, because of that generation, but in the late 60s and 70s, we did start seeing the growth of women getting into the workforce, which obviously, and you can look at the charts, I might have it available. You can see a decline in the males in the workforce. Mike has to, what's that message? You got to go, Mike.
Got to go teach.
It's funny. You're leaving right when we get to the hot, juicy women stuff. Mike goes.
I don't want to touch that one.
Neither of us are hot, juicy women anymore. We're too old and cold.
So Steve,
see you all next time.
See you later, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Steve, the boomers entering the workforce and the women entering the workforce, kind of maybe talk about that a little bit.
I think that's a major factor. A lot of my friends make this argument. I think they're quite right. When you had women turning up into the workforce, you had a dramatic increase in the number of people applying for jobs. And that, you don't have anything meaning that it's not just supply and demand that sets the wage bargaining power. I think that's a major reason for two things happened. You got lower wages and you had a higher level of income coming in, and most of it went to pay for the mortgage. So the explosion in mortgage debt and household costs began when basically the real beneficiaries of feminism weren't the women, you were the banks. Because suddenly you had twice as much money to put into a mortgage, you borrowed twice as much, you had more servicing costs, and that's the negative side of women's liberation for the women and the working class in general, was it weakened their bargaining power because it dramatically increased the number of people who could apply for a job. So I think in some ways that women's lib backfired on the women and the families in general by reducing the bargaining power of the working class against capitalists.
There you have it here first. Steve Keynes blaming women for all the problems in
Oh,
the
thank you. That's a nice little twist.
1970s.
Better than waiting somebody and put it. I get shafted by my friends on YouTube.
What
Thank
do
you, mate.
what do they call that on the news when they bait you into a gotcha question?
I
Now,
gotcha. Yeah, yeah.
everybody, to be clear, Steve's not advocating for that. I'm just trying to be a smart ass.
And you're succeeding. That's okay. Yeah.
But there is, we have to account for those dynamics. So,
We
you
do,
know,
yeah.
there's a big influx of women, and that changed things going around. So that's one of the factors. Now we kind of slide into some different parts, and we get into kind of energy and inflation during that time. How did, and let's spell it out. We know inflation changed things in the 70s. We had the energy shocks, and that affected real income. Steve, I just want you to lay out the dynamics of, you know, inflationary pressures affecting real incomes in an economic system. Put your academic hat on and just explain that to the audience, because then we can nuance some more things.
Yeah, well,
after.
a large part of it was the increase in oil prices, because if you go back to the oil, it became like a major factor in the economy only in the 1920s, really, with the building of the Model T Ford and then the expansion of vehicles for transportation, oil taking the place of coal and a lot of industrial processes and so on. But from the 1950s until 1973, the price that was paid to the mainly the Arab countries producing the oil was $2.50 a barrel, and it had been stuck there for a couple of decades, because that's what the companies are called, the Seven Sisters: Shell, BP, Aramco, and a few other companies. 7 oil companies dominated the market. They all basically presented the same front to the Arab states, saying, we're going to pay you $2.50 a barrel. Well, when the Yom Kippur War occurred, and of course that's the Arab countries lost that war in 6 days flat, the decision of the OPEC, which had just been formed at the time, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, put an embargo on any country that supported Israel. Well, guess which country got hit most? Of course, America. So suddenly there was oil wasn't available, and then the price of oil increased from $2.50 a barrel to 10, so a fourfold increase in the price of oil, and that occurred in 1973, which is one of the years that was the end of that boom period. That's why I say 73 more than 71 identify the real change. But that increase in energy costs fed through to the costs of all other goods. Oil was a ubiquitous commodity. So therefore, to actually pay the extra oil price, this is where endogenous money theory comes in. Companies had lines of credit, which is like having spare headroom on your credit card as an individual. When the oil price went up, they were forced to pay the extra, 4 times as much per barrel. They simply paid it, and that the increase in the price, inflation, caused the growth in the money supply, not the reverse that the monetarists make. So that caused an increase in the rate of inflation. And then 71, in terms of the level of economic activity, was also another boom, not quite as extreme as in the early 60s, but the unemployment rate in America just before from 1970 went from 5.8% down to 4.7%. So there was bargaining power for workers as well. They were paying higher prices for oil. They then demanded wage rises in compensation for the higher price of petrol at the Bowser. And so those factors meant you got inflation caused by basically disputes over the distribution of income. The Arab countries wanted more the money supply, the wealth for themselves, and the workers wanted to compensate for the higher price of oil. That's what caused the inflation, and the money supply rose to suit. And that was a major factor in the inflation. Was caused by a booming economy with suppressed costs for energy being liberated in 1 year, rather than having a gradual increase in the price of oil over the previous 20 years.
Okay, so we've gotten to the point here that we've identified at least two issues, for the 70s. One, demographics. We can't deny that, and I think it's understated when I read a lot of the rhetoric online
Mm,
with the, what the hell happened in 1971 or 73. We can just say that whole beginning of the 70s, and we
mhm.
can also identify the energy shocks obviously played an impact, which created more inflationary issues and other supply chains. Steve, you have a model you want to show, so let's do that next. I'll remind everybody, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave comments underneath the video. That's a real big kicker for YouTube to help with the algorithm. Unlike Steve, I don't get 250,000 views per video, and I can't sit here and brag about it like Steve does every week. So we need to get up there. So one of these weeks I beat Steve, and that will be an epic day for me. Steve, do you have that model ready if
It's
you
not
want to
model, it's
present?
actually data. So I'll actually
Okay.
quickly go and share the screen here, probably causing hassles, but let's see what happens. So let's go across and where is my share screen here? Okay, so entire screen, that one. So that is the level of private debt in the top graph, and credit and the unemployment rate in the bottom graph for America. And I've identified not 1971, but 1973 for the shit hits the fan level. But that's 1973 there. And what you can see is that you had a boom going on. This is credit, which is the annual change in private debt. It had been sort of flat in the post-war period, bouncing around a bit, but not a lot. But there was a real credit-based boom beginning in about 68, peaking in 73. And then we had the Yom Kippur War, increase in oil prices, all these things heading at once. And credit collapses from 12% of GDP down to, what is that, about 5% of GDP. That was the first major credit slump. So that's what caused the rise in unemployment. You can see unemployment was falling when the boom was going on, and then 73 hits, and unemployment blows up from, in America's case, from about 4.8% to about 8 or 9%. That broke those. Was that 7% there? Pardon me. That broke. No, that is 8.5%, 9%. So that broke the back of the union movement. You then had Volcker coming along as well at the same time, trying to control inflation by controlling the money supply. That just destroyed trade union power. And of course, you had the rise in manufacturing from Japan at the same time, taking jobs away from American companies. So the economy plunged. You had another boom. You can see the credit going up, unemployment going down. Another crash. That was in late 1970s, early 1980s. Then we had the Volcker recession. Unemployment breaks 11%. Okay. And that's basically just destroyed the power of the trade union movement to be anything. And then from that point on, I think we've been stuck in a financialized economy, because the level of private debt went from 50% of GDP back at the end of World War II. It cracked through, hit about 100% in 1975. It's been all up since then. That's the financialization of the economy, and that destroyed both the manufacturing sector and the trade union movement.
So you kind of touched on it there. Actually, let's. I saw cycles there, and I love
Yeah,
cycles.
yeah.
And I saw a credit cycle. Now I know there's some exogenous shocks there, obviously with the oil issues in the Middle East and et cetera, et cetera. But what drives the credit cycle? I know you answer this in your thesis with the Goodwin Keen Minsky growth cycle model, but kind of lay it out for the viewers. We know there was exogenous shocks, but we're also seeing a cycle there. What is the causal what's the causal loops in that cycle? How does that develop? How does it pertain to the business cycle?
Well, the main thing is that it's fundamental cycles in capitalism are driven by contests over the distribution of income. That's the original Goodwin model, and it turns up simply if you just work from macroeconomic definitions, you get the Goodwin cycle as pretty much the first macroeconomic model that turns up. And what you have is an increasing amount of money going to capitalists, means more investment, means the economy grows more rapidly. Then because it grows more rapidly, you hire more workers. Because you hire more workers, they've got more bargaining power. With their bargaining power, they negotiate more of the increase in revenue going to them than going to the capitalists. The capitalists end up with less profit than they expected when the boom began. So they cut back on investment. Investment falls, employment drops, workers lose bargaining power, and you get that classic income distribution cycle that gives us a Goodwin cycle. So that's the background, and you can well and truly see that in the data before the 1970 strikes, all the booms and busts and unemployment and so on. But then what we had at the same time was a rising amount of money, private debt. And one emergent property of my Minsky model, as you know very well, is that a rising level of private debt, even when the firms are the ones doing the borrowing, not the workers, turns up as reducing workers' share of income. That's an emergent property. I can explain the logic, but it's a bit hairy at this stage. So the rising level of private debt itself reduced the amount of money going to workers, which of course reduced their capacity to organise as well. So I think all this stuff is tied together. But the fundamental cause is the changes in the distribution of income and the rise in the amount of money going to the finance sector, which comes at the expense of the working class.
Great. So everybody, I want you to maybe start putting some questions in the chat. If it is a question, put question in front of it. I see so many. There's been like 300 comments. If it's a question, put question to start it, and then I'll try to hit it towards the end of the show. Steve, moving on here, and we've touched on it: neoliberalism, the financialization of the economy. Do you? I don't think it was caused before the 70s, but I think almost the 70s and what happened in the 70s generated that breeding ground of moving into the 80s and the explosion of financialism. Uh, is there a story there that what we saw in the 70s, the break between compensation and productivity, gave rise to the financial sector exploding in Western countries like the US, European countries, Japan to some extent? Is there a story there that the 70s was the origin of the growth of financialization?
Well, it's been happening all the way through because, again, the measure of how financialized your economy is how much private debt you have compared to GDP. And so from America's case, that reached a peak of about, like, using roughly the same figures as we use now, about 150% of GDP in 1932, and then it fell to 50%. All sorts of issues behind it, World War II itself, bank closures, debt write-offs by the Roosevelt government and so on. But you began at the beginning of World War II with the lowest level of private debt compared to GDP, not in recorded history, but for quite some time. And that meant the finance sector was weak. And my father, who was a banker at the time, used to say that if the governor of the Central Bank of Australia told the bankers to jump out the window, they'd ask which floor. Okay? So the power was definitely in favour of the state. There was a white paper passed in Australia, which is a policy paper, actually means the government's going to act on this, about employment. And just to take a line out of that, they said, given the horrors of the Great Depression and World War II, the objective of this white paper was to maintain such pressure upon employment as to guarantee a shortage of jobs rather than a shortage of men. That's a direct quote from the document. And that was like a global phenomenon after World War II. We have to keep unemployment down because we almost got communism during the Great Depression. Some of the biggest rallies in America at the time were by the Nazis, and other were by communists. So there was a real fear that if we don't give workers enough, there's going to be a revolution in America. And so that's part of the whole setting for this time. But the neoliberals were always anti-trade union. Neoclassical economics is completely anti-trade union. So all the way through, the economics profession was fighting against this. And Milton Friedman, of course, was the ultimate manifestation of that. And he blamed unions he blamed everything he didn't blame on the central bank, he blamed on trade unions. So the anti trade union elements, the ideology that gets pumped out, it was getting stronger and stronger in the 50s and 60s. By the 70s, the war was forgotten. 1945 was 25 years ago. A whole generation had grown up with hearing stories about the war, but not actually experiencing the war. I think those generational shifts were a major reason why the politics shifted as well. So rather than, notice you're being, AK Liberty Man looks like he's going for your
So,
jugular.
we'll start it off. So physiologically, Steve is healthier than the young guy.
The young guy, that must be you. Yeah,
That
okay,
must be the
the
young
young guy.
is going to box from a heart attack way before Steve. And I thank you for not using any words that we can't put on YouTube. Steve probably doesn't even have erectile dysfunction yet.
I'm
Steve is
sorry, I've
actually-
had prostate cancer. See, that's the ultimate form of erectile dysfunction. Thanks for. I wonder what he was talking about there. Are we now an X-rated show? You're blushing, my friend. You're blushing, young man.
So I've
Have a puff and like I might
I-
light up a joint. What do you reckon? That'd have been balanced the conversation.
I have reduced the nicotine content in this vape juice, so it will be sometime soon. I'm just vaping. I think it's basically some sort of canola oil. I don't know what's in it. It's some Chinese stuff. So it's not like smoking, but I get your point. You know, the nicotine is quite a destructive drug for the body. Any kids out there, young people vaping, if you're still doing the nicotine, it can still actually give you heart problems. It's not just the smoke itself. So AK is correct, right? We do have some legitimate questions, I think.
Oh, do we? That's a pity.
I
Okay, what
think
are they?
so. I think question, is there a way to reverse the terrible exploitation of feminism by the right in order to force down wages?
That's a good question. I mean, this is. I mean, I was born in the era of women's. Not born. I was raised in the era of women's liberation. So the '60s, when it was really coming to the fore, all the sexist attitudes in the '50s and '60s were, being attacked in the extremely high employment libertarian days of the 1960s, and it was seen by women. Women saw it as their right to be able to get a job. But what it ended up being that the right benefited because the women turning up for employment increased the competition for positions, and that was part of the weakening of the bargaining power of the working class. So there's a real dilemma there. You don't want to have women being boxed and left in the housewife functions and so on. But if you then say they're going to work, then they're going to be competing for labor positions. So it's really, really difficult to do. I think in some ways you have to really work at a social level and say inequality is destructive of a society's stability. That's the sort of stuff that Gary's economics is. I'm curious, when did Steve become an open borders shit lib? What the fuck is that about?
Well, so this is another thing for all our viewers I've discussed with Steve. Try not to look at the trolley comments from
that's
trolley
definitely a
trolls.
trolley comment. Let's ignore that one. But anyway, so goodbye troll. But yeah, I think women's liberation benefited the ruling class, not the working class, and that's the point. How the hell do you reverse that? To some extent, it has to be with things like the Japanese society has been better at than the Westerners have, and saying we've got to maintain some sort of floor to ceiling ratio between the lowest paid and the most highly paid in a company. And also you've got to keep some relationship between wages and profits on top of that. We've done neither, but I think it's taking income distribution seriously. So even though I've got criticized some of Gary's economics for his not understanding the monetary system, still living textbook economics on that front, the focus he's made on unemployment, I think, is on inequality is extremely important, and you can only address that at the social level. If you don't have those controls at the level of government level decision making and whole of working class union levels and management as well, then it'll break down in the marketplace, and that's what actually happened. So you got women getting jobs and being freed from domestic drudgery, etc., etc. But the end result was a fall in incomes going to working class people, and compensated by more working class people, men and women as well as women. But now you've got the dilemma that so many millennials and whatever the Gen Xers are and so on are caught up in, that the two incomes together aren't enough to buy a house. And that comes back to financialization, I think, is the real reason we've screwed up our economies, letting the banks take over.
So we've seen a shift during the pandemic, and it's interesting, and I want to get your opinion. For one, we're seeing obviously the baby boomers retire out of the workforce in
Mm,
droves at this point, and really starting in the 2010s and really accelerating now in the 2020s. But we also saw the shock of the pandemic shutdowns.
mm.
Now, different shocks than obviously the energy crisis in the 70s. But do you see some similarities between the 70s and the 2020s? Are we in a period that we could actually see compensation to workers start declining again? Well, productivity, like the boom in AI, is going up. Do you
Yeah.
see
That's a major issue. And like, there's people who believe in this idea of abundance, which I would love to see us achieve, but I think we're going to destroy it before we get there because of global warming. But nonetheless, that's the vision you'd like to get to. But of course, abundance means we're all benefiting from robots, we're all benefiting from AI, et cetera, et cetera. That's not what's going to happen. We're going to have, given the basic politics, if you have AI replacing so many middle class jobs, and then you have robotics replacing so many blue collar jobs, which could happen in a very grand scale over the next decade. That it further reduces the bargaining power of people who don't own capital. And so, in that point, we're likely to see wages declining even further. And the only way to remedy this, and I know that some that some wealthy capitalists are pushing this line. They think universal basic income is actually necessary. And this is now coming not from people wanting UBI as a way of liberating the working class, but wealthy people saying if we don't have some form of income generation for them, they won't be able to buy what our product factories can produce, and we're going to suffer as well. So the only solution is to bring in a universal basic income. And that's something coming out of the abundance people, as you and I know. And I think that's actually valid, because unless we do that, if we do get to the stage where machinery produces all the output and you don't need workers to produce goods and services anymore, then how are workers going to buy goods and services? You have to, unless you want to let 80% of the population starve to death, which tends not to work well for social cohesion, you're going to have to distribute income. So, in some ways, paradoxically, a lot of people who are very, pro-capitalist and very libertarian are beginning to conclude that the only way we can maintain a society going forward is if the government provides a basic income for everybody. And if you want to get more than that, you've got to be an entrepreneur, you've got to own capital. But the basic floor level of income is going to be set by a UBI.
Yeah, and I've always nuanced this with the people that have fears around AI, destroying their jobs and excluding a UBI right now because politically that's not feasible in most
Not at
countries.
the moment, no.
It's just we're so conservative at this point that there is a hard limit. You can get artificial intelligence or automation to produce all you want, but if nobody's going to buy it, there's no point in capitalists employing that. And in fact, that would slow. It makes a hard cap on that. We could say we're in an exponential rise right now. That is a capacity constraint, is demand itself.
Yeah.
And short of a UBI, and we get this isn't just about UBI, it's about what Keynes said, boosting aggregate demand, right? Short of
Yeah.
some artificial boost of aggregate demand, it peters out, and we don't see that revolution. And even with a UBI, that's when I start thinking about the limits to growth. Okay, well, then in that case, we're just accelerating exponentially all the raw resources we're using on this planet. And eventually we hit another point. We don't have any shit left, and we ain't on Mars yet. We ain't on the moon yet. And even if we
Yeah.
were, we got to bring that shit back to us. So
Mm.
I always nuance that with the people that fear AI is going to take over the world. Now, to get into a science fiction kind of aspect, if the machines start needing to consume themselves, like right, then they would start producing for themselves, and in that case we're in the matrix and we're fucked as humans at that point. But that's a far-fetched kind of scenario. We have some more questions here. We have some shitty questions, but I kind of like this one. Steve, when's your Bitcoin coming out?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I'd bought Bitcoin when I was first told about it by Max and Stacy. I could have bought it for basically a quid. I could have afforded to lose 1,000 quid and I would have made a couple of million. Didn't do it. My mistake. I didn't ride the speculative bubble. But I've always regard Bitcoin in particular, but also all the other crypto coins, as just being based on, first of all, not understanding money. And then the way that security is set up by Bitcoin was by energy consumption. So the security is that to actually try to break the system, you've got to use so much energy that it's not worth your while. So therefore, we know that the public ledger is going to be accurate. And basically, it takes 10 minutes to close a transaction because you want to burn that much energy in the process of generating confirmation that all the various ledgers agree. And then you give the bonus Bitcoin to the miner that generates the non-string. But all that stuff just means I think then this comes back to the energy issue as well. I see inevitable that we're going to run into energy constraints because of the impact of global warming and or the impact of how much harder it is now to get oil out of the ground. So they're going to lower energy return and energy invested at one extreme, which itself causes costs to rise per unit of output. And then when we finally wake up to global warming, that it's going to destroy the stability of the planet, we're going to realize we're going to have to cut back energy consumption radically. And the quickest thing to do would be to ban Bitcoin, ban international travel, ban tourism. And those two ways you could reduce energy consumption by about 8% overnight, if that was necessary. I think at some stage, our government's going to realize, holy shit, we've been conned by economists to believe climate change is not dangerous. Then why the fuck have we just lost a couple of million people by a flood or a drought or a wiping out of a food crop or heat exhaustion, et cetera, Then when the panic hits, then we'll do what we should have started doing 50 years ago. And that's going to drastically reduce energy consumption. And the most superfluous elements of energy consumption on the planet today are Bitcoin and tourism. And I think they're both going to be the first things to go. So I wouldn't want to be holding on to Bitcoin too long.
No, Tony, I have zero grasp on, resource limits. I never study the subject. I just think we can take it out of the ground forever. I don't know what you're driving at, Tony. Whatever it is.
You better, he's an Australian. If he does actually understand irony, but you better let him know you're Canadian. So you can actually exercise. You're not an American, so you're not making a serious statement there.
Okay.
The accent fools people. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible. That's like telling a poor New Zealander that he sounds like an Australian.
That's a terrible insult. Yeah, I know. That's why I got it in there.
Tony, how's that stain in the family working out for you? We got another question here. And this kind of relates to the UBI that we were just talking about. What about a guaranteed job?
That's
not
what
just
I actually
guaranteed
prefer.
minimum income.
I mean, like if you look at the moment, people talking in favor of UBI, if you actually just increased everybody's income by UBI, so I got paid the same amount as Rupert Murdoch as a basic salary, that would ultimately effectively end up driving up prices. But a guaranteed basic income is a different story. And I know a lot of the MMTs are anti-UBI, but I think it's valid at the moment because the UBI would just, it actually could cause an inflationary spiral. But if you have a guaranteed basic income, you'd have three levels for the working class: getting paid in a full-time job, public sector or private; not being employed but getting a job guarantee, meaning you've told you have to go and do a particular type of work, which may or may not be what your skill set is, but it guarantees you a pay. And if you don't want to do that at a lower level, a guaranteed basic income, which is still enough to buy enough goods and services to stay alive. So I'd go for a three-tier system. And then with the guaranteed basic income, if we suddenly saw a dramatic expansion in robotics and manufacturing and a collapse in employment for working class, for white collar workers inside companies and the government, then in that situation, you'd slowly transit from a guaranteed basic income towards a universal one, because you simply couldn't find work for most people. You'd have to expand the guaranteed scheme to take over as employment collapsed in both government jobs and private sector jobs, working class and white and blue collar and white collar.
I got another question here from Graham. Do you think a Jubilee tax will shrink inequality and thus cause those with plenty already to invest more wisely, Steve?
I think he means my idea of a Jubilee, a reset, a global debt reset with a modern debt Jubilee. I'm not sure if that's what he actually means. But uh, the capacity of people to get caught up in financial bubbles has never ceased to amaze me. And I basically expect if you do anything like this at the moment, rather than wiser investing, you'll get people going back and speculating and gambling with the extra money on asset prices. So I think you need a range of policies that basically reduce the capacity to have financialized systems and mean that if you're going to borrow money, it's for investing in actual productive capability. It's not for speculating on the price of houses or shares. So, and we need far more public investment as well, which is one of the things that the neoclassicals have destroyed, the whole idea of public investment. That's one reason America's in the shape that it's in versus China, where there's tons of public investment. And you can see that the vast, not the vast majority, but probably the majority of goods we consume these days are public goods. Yes, we have our private pleasures, but a lot of the things, it's easy transportation, clean air, decent health, decent education. China's building all the public stuff. America's been destroying it. I really can't see the Americans waking up to themselves.
Thanks, Steve. And that was what Graham was talking about. So thanks, Graham. Great question. I could broker this. I do talk to Gary on DMs through Twitter a lot.
Do
He is
you? Okay.
yeah, he is a busy guy. So he's bottom line is all of us are content creators in the modern age for economics. So we all have our own agenda. So
Yeah.
a lot of people want to see these dream matchups, and they're going the way of the dinosaur, like the Bob Murphys and the Warren Mosler battles in academic settings. It doesn't happen so much in personal content creation, because we all have our agendas and our views.
But might add, Bob and I are going to have a talk on the Demystifying Science podcast in a couple of weeks' time, and Michael Hudson and I and Ann Pettifor are going to be on a David Graeber Institute discussion at some point. So I think what you need is to have forums like that, get people like you and me and Michael and Gary together and have the debates there and they're like the other podcasts are like news reports pointing back to our own system. So I hope we can actually have that discussion with Gary.
Yeah.
Just another guy, Ed Conway from Sky.
Yeah.
Okay. Ed and I had a really good conversation about a case he put forward on Sky recently, which is pushing the standard line about, government debt's going to explode. Had a great conversation about it. He's hopefully going to have a get together on my podcast and me on his at some point. Richard Murphy and I have done one together. So I think there's some possibility for that cross fertilization.
Yeah, it is when you guys are in agreeable, like you and Hudson and Pettifor.
It's a party.
You guys are all the same. You're going to agree with each other, and that's great. I think we need more unified forces in heterodox economics, because we end up just battling each other until
like the left never stabs itself in the back or shoots its feet off or votes for the Judean People's Front over the People's Front of Judea. That never happens. It's only in fiction.
It's so dangerous with social media to have what you were calling cross-pollination. For instance, Gary has an agenda, and it's I think an honorable one. I disagree with some of the things he says, and I'm sure you do. But in the world of social media and sound bites, it's so dangerous to have those kind of social media debates now, because that hangs around forever. It could one could feel like it could damage their credibility. But you know what? I'll reach out to him and see what we can do. you.
Yeah, sure.
Tony, you can't put questions and then make a statement. You have to actually have questions before. So you're abusing the question system. That is deleted. Our buddy Reagan Boychuk, and we get along all the time, but he does have a good question here. Could Ravel model Romer 1993 and Bill Blatt's control fraud? It could reveal the geographic evolution of financialization in the 70s as following reserves during the savings and loans debacle. Steve, your thoughts?
Okay, look, I don't know the Ackle and Roma paper you're talking about necessarily there, Regan, but obviously I know Bill Black on control fraud. Bill Black, for those who don't know him, was he was the person who was responsible for prosecuting all the frauds in the savings and loans crisis, which occurred under Reagan. You're talking decade back in the 80s, and Bill reckons he put about 300 bankers behind bars. Of course, we've all forgotten about the savings and loans. How many were put behind bars during the global financial crisis? One, Bernie Madoff, and you couldn't not put Bernie Madoff behind bars. So Bill was a brilliant, understood the way in which financial people in the financial sector would cause Ponzi schemes to rip off other people in the financial sector. And he's wrote a brilliant book, the title of which is "The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One." Now, what that means is you can show control fraud that way. And in terms of Ravel being able to model it, the mafia, of course, does double entry bookkeeping. They have one set of books they show to the authorities with no profit. They have another set of books to say make sure they know where the profit's going and not being ripped off by some turkeys in the system. So you could do a double entry. You'd need to have a fictional account system and the real account system and show the divergence between the two. It's feasible. I haven't tried to do it, but I'm sure it's possible using Ravel's tools.
Now, here's a statement from Romanium 14, and I don't know what the difference is that you and Hudson have on Marxism. So, Steve, is there some differences? And if so, what are they?
Actually, Michael and I haven't discussed our differences on Marx. We could probably do that. My difference on Marxist is all I'm a Marxist because that was actually my original research area in economics. I read Das Kapital in 1973, another reason to like that year or worry about it. And I saw that Marx actually had a philosophical explanation for surplus in capitalism, which undermined the labor theory of value. Now, I was laughed at by my fellow students at the time because, I don't know, maybe you can call them a cult, and they didn't like my arguments. But I then did my master's thesis trying to find where Marx came up with his alternative to the labor theory of value. It ended up being something he did in 1857 while writing what's called the Grundrisse, which is apparently German for rough draft, and that was the rough draft of Capital. He reread Hegel in the middle of reading all the classical economists because he was getting ready for the revolution, which he thought would happen very shortly. And that alternative explanation that I've developed further ends up saying that labor is not the only source of profit. So arising what Marx called organic composition of capital, which means more machines per worker, does not mean the rate of profit's going to fall. So therefore, there's no inevitability of socialism. That's my interpretation of Marx. Michael's a scholar of the first order. We had never actually got around to discussing Marx because we discussed Fisher and Minsky and economic data far more often. But yeah, we're having a get together with him, myself and him, and Ann Pettifor, so we might actually raise that issue and see in what ways Michael's perspective differs from mine.
Interesting stuff. I look forward to that. That conversation is going to be posted online, obviously.
It's going to be live online. I'll actually check and see what the date is.
Perfect. That's great. I'll address this question from Frank. Yes, boy, oh boy, the Blue Jays have put the American League on notice, Frank. And Judge, it was funny. I know Steve doesn't know what we're talking about. We're talking about baseball right now.
I gather it was something foreign. Yeah.
So that home run, that was like 3 inches on that foul pole, and it wasn't a home run. And that's about all they did. And Guerrero, He has turned it up in the postseason. I think we're not even watching the 2015-26 type Blue Jays. We're watching 1993 World Series champion Blue Jays. So Frank, I am watching this as an historic moment in Blue Jays history for sure. From Jacket D, Steve, where do you keep your money? Now, I'm hoping it's not underneath the
I ain't got
mattress.
no money. I ain't got no money. There'll be many people not have seen this, but I've had 2 family members that I gave money to, and it got stolen. Okay. One 8 years ago, one about 3 months ago. So my finances have been wiped out by being too trusting, which I'm not going to change my personality, but that's what led me into this trap I'm in. So I own my house in Amsterdam outright. That's about the end of my financial assets. But I'm trying to become a capitalist billionaire with my software package Ravel. And let's see how we go on that particular front.
Well, I know you're getting rich off those 500,000 views on YouTube all the time. And on that note, because my channel does not get a 500,000 views per video or per all the videos of all time, even the ones I've deleted don't even come close. You can find me on my Patreon, patreon.com/relearning economics, and as low as $4.99 a month, get all of my blogs, even the ones I keep behind that paywall. And that would help me out tremendously. If you have any questions, remember, put question before the comment you're going to make sure the question is not a statement but an actual question, and I will put it up on screen. We do have a comment that's worth looking at here from AK again on X. If you're watching on X, do all those things I want you to do on X. If you need a UBI for people to buy stuff in a state of abundance, then you don't use debt as an intermediary, just use a command token. Steve, any thoughts on that?
Well, the command token means money, basically. And like you're dead right, you can't have a UBI based on private debt. So a UBI would have to be financed by government money creation. And that's exactly, of course, what people talk about. Rather than paying a dole, you'd pay a UBI. And like if we did, let's fast forward. If we say, if we get to the point where computers, AI has replaced almost all white collar jobs and robots have replaced all blue collar jobs, then the only way the money is going to be potentially created is by the government creating it and then distributing it. So the white collar, ex-white collar workers and ex-blue collar workers can still buy goods and services produced by computers, AI, and robots. And I think that's if we get to that point, let's put this in the long brush of human history. If you look at what we've done as a species, we were hunter-gatherers. So everything we did was what we caught for ourselves until about 12,000 years ago. Then we started to grow plants. So we're using the energy from the sun to create food. We captured animals. We had domesticated animals. Then we had slavery. We'd capture other slave tribes and make them do what we wanted them to do. Basically, what you're doing is getting people who contain energy to do work you want them to do for your benefit. Then we get to the Industrial Revolution, the use of fossil fuels. We now have fossil fuel slaves that are doing the work for us. For most of us benefit to that extent massively from the energy that is now doing the work that slaves and animals used to do, but far more, of course, because you can put far more petrol inside a car than you can put food inside a horse. So dramatic increase in the amount of energy per capita we're consuming. What you want to get to is a world in which the energy is turned into useful work by machines, and we go back to having the leisure effectively we had back in the Cro-Magnon days, when it appears we worked 2 days and party for one, was quite a common situation. Of course, with all the drawbacks, no dentistry, no health, diseases rampant, and so on and so forth. But the ultimate objective should be, and I believe this is what Musk talks about when he's not being a right-wing nerd, is enabling people to be creative and not have to work for a living, but to use their energy and intelligence in artistic and creative things rather than having to make goods and services. That's the world we want to get to. We want to get there by destroying ourselves in the process. And my great fear for the future is all the conflict that's become part of human nature. Well, it's been part of our nature forever. But if we have conflict over this potential outcome, we won't get to the abundance. We'll get to the Hunger Games or Mad Max. And those are the two futures that terrify me. And I'd rather see us reaching even if I think the abundance agenda ignores the dependence that has upon energy and the inability to do that on a fixed biosphere, particularly when the energy is coming from fossil fuels. We do want to get to a world in which abundance is shared and humans are freed from the mechanical drudgery of making goods and services. We now have machines that do it for us. We have to distribute the largesse from the machines. Otherwise, we'll end up in a society. Again, I think the Hunger Games is, if society holds together and we don't fix up this distribution issue, then the Hunger Games is our future.
So bleak, Steve. That's Steve's message. Just bleak Mad Max, destruction, mayhem, apocalypses. Woo!
Yeah, good party material. Good stuff. Yeah. Planet of the Apes minus the apes.
Graham, I try to, on my community posts, I do update where the channel's at. We're at, so there's two levels of monetization, 3,000 hours of watch time per year and 4,000. I'm at 2,800. So I'll get the first level of monetization, which is the super chat option, probably in the next live stream or two. And then, you guys can start giving me money for no reason in the chat, and I'll greatly appreciate that. And listen, I'm not a car salesperson, right? At the end of the day, all of this social media shit is entertainment, but I am basically self-employed now through my Patreon and contract work. So, if you want to, think of me as a bum on the street, and I got my bag out, and I look like this. Right, and I'll have a sign.
Didn't change at all, Ty.
I'll have a sign saying I need to eat or something like that, and that'll hopefully come here as I get to the 3,000 hours, and then after that it's 4,000 hours. But that's for ads, and if I'm not getting a 500 million views like Steve is now, because he likes to say that he's getting 500 million views, which you're probably in your total channel totals, you might actually be.
No, it's about I think actually Jordan kept track of this, and the guy who does my marketing for my online course. I think we're past 8 million hours of views, or about 10 million hours. So that is a reasonable number, but it ain't billions, it's millions.
No, views as in all of your videos over the last 12 years have you're probably close to a 500 million views.
You think so?
All your videos. Yeah, you can actually look at your YouTube page and go to your about page, and it'll show your total views. You probably, maybe not a 500 million, but maybe 100 million, maybe 50 million.
I'll look, let's say analytics, and take a look at the yeah, I don't know. I'll see if I can find it. But like the most recent video, the one on Australian house prices, that's got 500,000.
No, if you go to your main homepage on YouTube and you go to the about tab, you should it should show the total views for your channel.
Okay, your channel, and I'm stuffing around here a bit, mate. I've got home. Is it on YouTube Studio, or
you have 7,301,000 views total? I just looked.
There you go. That's what I told you. Millions, not billions.
Yeah, it's in the more right in the description. If you click on more on your homepage, it shows your totals. Anyways, that's a side note. And yes, Romanium 14, I am a burden on society. My better half says that all the time. So
burden on her. Yeah,
I am well aware of that. We have another question from Jacka D. Question here is, which asset classes do you think will increase over the coming 5 years? Put your investment hat on, Steve.
Don't have one. I've never speculated. I don't like the whole damn thing. And my
And
personal revulsion means I haven't actually gambled.
instead of asset classes, let's say what sectors in the coming decade are going to be important to humanity in the economic system?
Mm. Um, You're sort of saying, where's the next major innovation going to come from? I think the main thing is robotics. If I had to say what's going to drastically change society, it's robotics being able to replace manual labor. And equally, I mean, if you can replace manual labor in the factory, then you replace manual labor in the home as well. So I think the robotics and enabling robots to take over process work and take over home maintenance, that's probably the most dramatic increase, the most dramatic change is robotics. And I think on that front, I think, again, Musk is hoping to get there, to be number one with his Optimus robots, but it may well be the Chinese who get there first, because if you compare the rate of innovation that appears to be happening in China's robotics versus American, looks like the Chinese are in the lead again. So I think we're buying Chinese robots to take over manufacturing, mainly in China, and then also domestic robots for the West.
Tony, again, the question has to be a question. You've essentially said somebody's explained it. Question: do you know how much energy? In other words,
It's less than
Tony,
10%. I'm sure of that.
uh,
You
uh,
get
uh,
you get you get you get losses. Energy in a liter of fuel gets used to transport the human. So you're starting a liter of fuel, from Saudi Arabia to getting into your car. I'd be amazed if 10% is more likely 5% of the energy actually gets used to move the car forward. There's an enormous amount of um, of waste in our systems. You've got to ship those fossil fuels from where they are to where they're going to be used. You've got to process them. Again, more energy content coming out of the processing. You've got to ship them back to where they get bought by the consumer. They then go into the vehicle. The vehicle itself, again, even if you would just ignore the fact that vehicles get stuck in traffic, the amount of energy, about 1/3 of the energy, I think, put into the tank actually moves the car forward. I believe about 2/3 of the energy is wasted. So I'd say if you're going to start from actually the oil well and go to when you get to the vehicle being used for transportation, you'd be lucky to hit 10%.
YouTube channel for all. Not a question, but an interesting comment. The energy problem can be fixed, so
Oh,
that
can it
leaves
now? Okay, you've
politics. Now,
sorry.
yeah. So the energy problem I see as a
30%
capacity.
in that case, Tony. So to clarify his question, so about 30%.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
I don't know why you answered Tony's question. It was a statement that I told you he was just going to make a statement so he
of
could say
course. He wanted to
you're wrong, Steve.
yeah. Energy loss is
Right.
60%, so I think I'm pretty close to the number. Okay. 1%. What, you're kidding? Of the liter of petrol going in to the engine, 1% drives the car forward? That's more extreme than I would have thought. But back to the energy problem can be fixed. I'm sorry, that's delusional. Um, and this is what I find with neoclassical economists all the time. So a guy called Daniel Susskind wrote a book called Growth, the Reckoning, which supposedly explained where growth came from. And he completely ignored energy in the process and also argued we're decoupling GDP from energy. When you take a look at the global data, which of course is the sort of data that I use, the correlation between change in GDP and change in energy is north of 0.8. So basically, GDP is energy turned into useful work. And you cannot fix that problem at the moment without making GDP based on something other than energy, which isn't possible, or you've got to completely change your energy system, and we're doing it far too slowly. So, like, if you were going to make that replacement, you'd need to have nuclear power properly worked out. You'd need to have a, a, a large number of so-called renewable energy sources. We haven't got it, so I don't think it can be fixed. And it's actually the politics that is part of why we haven't done it, because neoclassical economists have said, "Don't worry about it, not a problem. What the fuck would they know?" We're about to find out how little they know. So I think the energy problem is going to be what brings us unstuck. We're not going to fix it; it's going to fuck us.
Now, just to be clear, a YouTube channel for all, you're a great viewer, and Steve didn't say you're delusional, but the question or comment you posed, he might have said was quite delusional.
Yeah.
There's a hard limit on
That is a
energy.
political. Sorry, Tim. It's a technical problem. Like, for example, people talk about thorium reactors as a replacement for uranium, going much larger level of uranium and so on. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a physicist, but I've been told by people who work in the field there's about 200 chemical operations to go from raw lithium to something you can actually put inside a molten salt reactor, and then the molten salt reactor itself, you've got to stop the salt itself corroding. There's huge technical problems to solve.
Okay, so we got another question here from Jacked. Jack D. Jack D. Hey, Jack D. Can you see? Hold on, let me take your
You got to
question
stand
down.
up, mate. Just show us the full chest. Come on, give us the flop.
Look at
Okay.
this shirt I put on. So I'm getting suplexed by life. Jacked D. I figured you'd appreciate that, but he's got a good question here. Which parts of the world are going to be the safest to deal with global warming? And I'm assuming that's a question where we're living, where you might have to migrate to, et cetera, et cetera. Any ideas on, the different effects of global warming in different parts of the planet? Steve.
Well, I mean, it's destructive across the whole planet, but the question is, where's the destruction going to be least, or where can people make the most dramatic compensation for it? I'd write off Europe and America. Europe, and the only part of Europe that I think is going to have any chance of survival on the front is the Netherlands, because their food production is so great compared to their population that they have a buffer if things go wrong. Whereas for countries like the UK imports about 50% of its food. It's screwed if there's a global famine. And I think so. The directions of global warming are going to eliminate food production in Europe. And if we have the collapse in the AMOC, then the temperature in Europe is going to fall 10 degrees over the next 3.5 decades once it starts breaking down. So that, I think Europe's going to be uninhabitable in that situation. America, it's bad enough without global warming. I wouldn't want to be there when global warming strikes and people use guns for shopping rather than just the ice nonsense that's happening at the moment. I think of Asia, Africa to some extent, and particularly the only country I think is likely to hold together through this is China, because they appear to be getting ready to be completely energy self-sufficient and food self-sufficient. They're not yet at the energy level. They're close. Food looks like they're doubling their arable land by reclaiming a desert by a grand scale public works project right now. If they pull all that off, then as a society, I could see China surviving. But apart from that, you want a recommendation where to go to survive it? Move to the New Guinea Highlands.
Okay, and just a clarification, it's not Jacked D, it's actually Yatzek. Am I
Yatzek.
correct there? Okay,
Yatzek. Okay.
and it's Polish, but this is, I guess, from a movie, Robert and Frank, 2012 movie, have not seen. Interesting. We've got another question here from AK. Good question here. Should econ be absorbed back into physics department? Econ in the US evolved out of the physics department at Yale, and a physicist protractor,
Supervised, proctored,
the first PhD. Steve, your thoughts?
Look, I think yes. I mean, economics is a wasted discipline. It's useless. It's totally delusional. And if we're going to get back to a reasonable basis for analyzing the economy, then we have to adopt what the physicists and engineers have developed, rather than what economists have stuck in 19th century equilibrium static thinking. And think about the system as the economy as a complex system, which is beyond neoclassical economists, because every second word they use is equilibrium. And if you're in equilibrium, you don't change. So you don't even get the foundations of complexity, which is the real basis of the economy. So I would love to see physicists take over. I was very disappointed with econophysics because I thought that was the beginning of it. What actually happened was physicists have developed incredible statistical tools for handling, measuring radiation impacts inside a nuclear reactor. And what they wanted was, we want to use our techniques which are designed for handling large amounts of data in economics. Where can we find large amounts of data in economics? Finance markets. So econophysics, rather than being focused upon giving an alternative approach to economics, became different ways to analyze the financial markets. And they really haven't developed the type of alternative economics I wanted to see them do. I actually wrote a paper with Paul Omerand and a couple of others called Worrying Trends in Econophysics back in 2004. And I think that's actually been borne out by what's actually happened, because rather than developing an alternative paradigm, they've just become a little specialization in finance, which I see as a great pity. So in that sense, I'm not focusing my interests upon physics. I'd actually think I want to have engineers taking over economics, because at least engineers are involved in applied problems, and that's what we need. And the engineering approach tends to be more top-down system analysis. So that's why my most recent book was called Money and Macroeconomics from First Principles for Elon Musk and other engineers. And the idea is I want them to take over and use their approach, complex systems. If we ever get to the stage of being truly sophisticated finite element analysis and so on, all the things engineers have developed to analyze complex systems is the sort of thing economists should be doing, and they never do it. So I want to stop letting economists practice economics. They're better. I'd rather have them take over Scientology.
And here's a good follow-up question then. Is complex systems too hard to teach at the bachelor
Nah.
level? That's what the neoclassical professors imply. I can verify that a complex system method, system dynamics, can be taught literally probably to a grade 5, grade 6, grade 7 basics. And by early high school, junior high school, you should be able to build complex system models with the tools we have today. But Steve, elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, complex systems is it's exciting, it's organic in a way that equilibrium thinking is not. So if you get students and show them they can build things like a Sikorsky triangle for a complex systems, a chaotic systems process, show them the Mandelbrot plot, let them build that, show them predator-prey systems, they'll be turned on by it. It's far more exciting than bloody equilibrium thinking. So I think complex systems would be definitely the way to go. And to understand it, I mean, that this is one reason that the original system dynamics programs use the idea of taps and baths, flows and stocks that way, but as physical things people are used to turning on a tap and watching a bath fill up and that sort of thing. So if you get students to think in an analogy between taps and bathtubs, you can explain system dynamics to them. And if you show they can actually simulate something interesting, then you do have a way to teach this stuff at the bachelor level, certainly. And like bachelor level means you should be able to handle complex numbers, integration, all the stuff that mathematicians do. And I did all that stuff in my first year at university as well. If the engineers can cope with it, and the IQ level of engineers is comparable to those people who go into economics, the economists can learn it as well. It's only too hard to teach at the bachelor level because neoclassical economists teach simplified shit and they don't realize you can teach interesting stuff. It's the fault of the economists, not the fault of the methodology. It's the basic complex systems is the three system state set of nonlinear differential equations. And they're extremely simple in that sense.
And this kind of adds on. And so Reagan says, how do citizens and government counter industry colluding through system dynamics? Because Steve just pointed it out. For one, it's so engaging, system dynamic modeling. If you look at the limits to growth, it was so engaging for its time. The question is there funding out there to back a big study up like that, Reagan? So if you have an idea, you need the funding to get the researchers in there to build an extensive model. These are big models. They're not just little toy models. And you can engage the mind that way, build some interfaces, put your papers out. People love visuals of graphs and stuff because it puts big issues into perspective for them instead of just describing a big issue and saying, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do. This is what we do. You can put a couple plots in front of them. This is what's going to happen. And this is what's going to happen if we do this, or this is what's going to happen when we do this. So it really comes down to funding, Reagan. So if you get a big mass amount of funding, go out there, find your researchers, hire them, and get a model built on the issue with colluding in industries, because it would probably be very fascinating. Do we have any questions left in the chat? I do see one more here from Dr. T. Question: likelihood function to show individual mean variance co-found is what anybody at university should know. So what ain't it done? Because it is too scary to neoclassicals.
Got to interpret that a bit, but yeah, what you get, neoclassicals teach stuff which always ends up in equilibrium. And if you get in, like well, one thing about a power law distribution is that there can be, if you measure the standard deviation of a process that has an evolutionary process that has a power law distribution, you can get an infinite standard deviation, which makes no sense at all compared to the Gaussian stuff that neoclassicals teach, where everything's in the normal distribution and the possibility of anything being more than 5 standard deviations from the mean is basically impossible. Whereas with a complex system, you can get a measure 20 or 30 standard deviation movement. So it's this stuff, the neoclassical thinking with its obsession about equilibrium and believing stuff comes from exogenous shocks, which they presume are normally distributed, it's all a waste of time. But it gets in the way of people thinking sensibly about complex systems.
And you've been told, this will be the final one. You've been told not to do something, Tony.
Tony, the people going in to economics probably are close to the same IQ as an engineer on average when they go enroll, because they think it's a nice way to make a living. When they come out the other end, they've had a lobotomy. Okay, an intellectual lobotomy. That's why engineers are smarter than economists.
Well, that pretty much concludes this week's live stream. We actually covered a lot today. I think this was a very insightful conversation on, what the fuck happened in 1971. I think it was insightful. We have to admit at the end of the conversation that things did happen. Bretton Woods, the rules of international engagement did change. Nixon did drop the gold standard. It probably had some influences throughout the economy, but some of the bigger factors we've discovered was obviously demographics, right? Demographics played a huge role in the shifts we saw in the 1970s with the entry of a lot of young workers, baby boomers, and the entry of women into the workforce. And we also saw some energy shocks that were exogenous, so they were separate from any gold bug, gold standard stuff. So it's a nuanced situation, and we're also, I think, concluding that we could see some of the same things in the 2020s. Obviously, we've got different shocks now, but we are seeing a new demographic come into play, right? So we could see not the exact situation. That's not how the world works, but we could see a pattern that we saw in the 70s occur in the 2020s, maybe going into 2030s. And obviously with climate change, environmental degradation, we could see some amplified effects. So, and hopefully not, but it sure seems like we're traveling down that path, and I'm a path dependent type person. So that's what we discovered today. Steve, thanks for being on again. It was fun.
I'm trying to help out your flimsy channel, mate.
I was just going to say, you're probably now going to go do one of your big fancy 500,000 view videos.
I've got to record another video on house prices. I've been running a few days behind schedule and getting that done. Hopefully I'll finish it tomorrow.
Thankfully, you have a YouTube channel again. There was a time
where God, that was talk about getting caught by a phasing email. I don't want to go through that again. And yes, Romanian, we'll have a chat to Michael about Marx.
All right.
That's next week, 2 hours before this live show. So whatever that time, for me, it's 5 o'clock in Europe. It'll be 11 o'clock in New York. That's next Thursday with the next Friday with the David Graeber Institute.
Perfect. Sounds good. Everybody, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
You are now relearning economics.